And turn back to the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah. Find the area of chapter 1, chapter 2. Last week, we learned from Nehemiah what to do when things go wrong. Remember? What to do when things go wrong? And if I were maybe going to recast some of those instructions, some of the things that we should do when things go wrong, I would say that you could do these 4 things. First of all, when things go wrong, get humble. Get humble. Become humble if you need to be. Put yourself in a position of being humble. The second thing that I would say, and this kind of goes along with the first one, the second thing to do when things go wrong would be to draw near to God. Right? Draw near to God. The third thing to do when things go wrong, I would say to you from Nehemiah's example, would be to pray urgently. Pray urgently. And then the fourth thing that I would tell you to do when things go wrong, having become humble, drawn near to God, having prayed urgently, fourthly, I would tell you to be ready to act. Be ready to act. And by the way, that might mean waiting for a while, but find yourself in a position of readiness. Be ready to act. Look at chapter 2. Let's walk through these verses here. The first 6 verses we'll begin really by reading. This is what happened next. Nehemiah had done those things. He'd humbled himself. He'd drawn near to God. He'd prayed urgently. He had dressed himself in readiness. He was ready to act. This is what happened next. Chapter 2. Notice here that Nehemiah is still writing in the first person. This is his memoir. Look what he says. Now it came about in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, that wine was before him. And I want you to pause there for just a moment. This is 4 months later. This is not the next day. He's waited a while. He's still praying and fasting. He's still seeking God's face in this. By the way, verse 1 leads us to believe that perhaps this moment that God brought him to might well have been a festival. Wine was before the king. You can almost see the ceremony here. I took up the wine and gave it to the king. It's perhaps a ceremony or a festival. Look at verse 2. This is an interesting statement he makes. Now I had not been sad in his presence. It was not a good thing to be sad in the king's presence. So the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, though you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart." Look at this statement. Then I was very much afraid, because it's not a good thing to be sad in the presence of the king. So I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate and its gates have been consumed by fire?" Then the king said to me, "What would you request?" So I prayed to the God of heaven. I said to the king, "Then, if it please the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." Then the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, "How long will your journey be, and when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me, and I gave him a definite time. I have to tell you that reading that again brings us back to Proverbs 21:1. Remember? Proverbs 21:1 says that the king's heart, doesn't matter which king, by the way, the king's heart is like channels of water in the hand of Yahweh. He turns it wherever he wishes. That is sovereignty. Unbeknownst to Artaxerxes, he served Yahweh. And so just that quickly, Nehemiah is going to be going to Jerusalem. And his mission, His mission, which he himself had asked to be sent on, his mission would not only be difficult, it would prove to be dangerous. We'll see that in coming weeks. That's because things were bleak in Jerusalem. You remember the report, the city's defensive fortifications were non-existent. The wall was burned down, right? It had been torn down, burned down. That would have gone all the way back to the conquest of Jerusalem by Babylon. It had never been able to be successfully rebuilt. Apparently there had been some attempts. But the foes, the enemies of the Jews, had continually torn down their attempts at rebuilding the walls. And so the city had no defensive fortifications. And remember, you need to couple that with the fact that the non-Jewish population in the area hated the Jews. And again, we'll see more about that in coming weeks. The Jews were targeted. They were downtrodden. They were drifting toward sin, as we saw last week. They were at risk constantly of being overwhelmed militarily and culturally and religiously. Things were bleak. And with that in mind, Nehemiah's mission wasn't only to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. A lot of times we think of him as the wall builder. We think of him as the guy that was sent back to be the construction manager. And folks, he was that. But that's not all he was. In fact, I would say that was not even the most important thing that he was sent back for. His mission wasn't merely to rebuild the walls. His mission was ultimately about strengthening the people of God. It was about renewing their dignity. It was about helping them again to be able to hope in the Lord. Put simply, I would tell you that first and foremost, that Nehemiah's mission was a spiritual mission. And as difficult and as dangerous as it would prove to be, seemingly against all the odds, Nehemiah was successful. You know that if you know his story. He was successful. And I think that that makes Nehemiah's story important for us because, listen, as a people, Nehemiah's story is important for us because as a people, and I mean as individuals, but also corporately as a church family, as a people, we've also been called and sent by God on a mission. Isn't that right? None of us in the Christian faith are called to complacency. Christianity is not a spectator sport. We're to be participants in the mission. We've been called by God. We've been sent by God on mission. What that means is that there's great value in learning, examining Nehemiah's success, seeing what we can learn from him. And so that's what we're going to do for today and probably for the next week or two. And as we do that, as we examine Nehemiah's story, we're going to take away some important commitments based on his service that we need to make in order to be able to persevere through challenges and to be able to serve effectively the way that he served. Nehemiah is going to be our example. He's going to serve as a role model for us. We'll identify five commitments. 5 commitments that we need to make in order to be able to persevere through hard times, and while persevering through the hard times, to still be able to serve well. And we're going to split them up. Going to have just 2 today, 3 next week. Let's get right into them. Again, here's the question. A couple of questions. First of all, do you realize that you've been called to serve? I hope that you do. And secondly, if you realize that you've been called to serve, is your desire to serve well? If you answer yes to those questions, you can learn much from Nehemiah. Let's look at these 5 commitments. The first of them is foundational. Probably spend a little bit more of our time here on the first one than on the second one. First commitment that we see in Nehemiah's life is foundational. Here it is. To persevere as the people of God in this fallen world and to render effective service to God, we must first of all trust God continually, regardless of our temporal circumstances. To be able to persevere, to be able to serve God well, we must first of all trust Him continually, regardless of whatever may be going on around us. What an interesting week to be studying this text. There's a lot of strange stuff going on around us. A lot of distracting stuff. Folks, we need to be able to put that aside. We need to be able to say, I am not going to buy into the fear. I'm going to act in faith. Nehemiah's story is one of faith. Nehemiah's story begins with faith because he was a faithful man. I want you to see this. Nehemiah's life was marked by amazing spiritual courage. And by the way, what is spiritual courage if it's not faith lived out? Is that what courage is? It's faith lived out. Nehemiah's life was marked by amazing spiritual courage. Listen, amazing spiritual courage that did this for him. It positioned him to be able to accomplish incredible things. Look at chapter 2, verse 2 again. Remember the context here? It's perhaps a festival. Nehemiah apparently is wearing his heart on his face, on his countenance. Artaxerxes observes this. Look at this, verse 2. So the king said to me, why is your face sad, though you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart. Then I was again very much afraid. And let me just sort of, let me give you maybe a paraphrase there. Gulp. Do you remember who Artaxerxes is? This is the most powerful man in the world. By the way, history tells us a little bit about him. He was kind of a capricious fellow. This is not a good guy to get on the wrong side of. Probably an easy guy, by the way, to get on the wrong side of. Artaxerxes, here's another paraphrase, verse 2, he says, Nehemiah, what's wrong with you? How dare you come before my presence showing sorrow? Nehemiah, of course, was very much afraid. But here's what I want you to see. Afraid though he was, Nehemiah did not let his fear hold him back. Look at this. I said to the king. And the idea is again that there's not any intervening conversation, just that fast. I said to the king. Let the king live forever. That's a kind of a nice recovery. Let the king live forever. But look, he continued, why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate and its gates have been consumed by fire? Now, look at verse 4. And remember that by this time Nehemiah has been fasting intermittently and praying for months. Look at verse 4. Suddenly, look at this. Then the king said to me, what would you request? And just that quickly, Nehemiah's circumstances have completely changed. The conversation began with Artaxerxes scolding him for appearing before him sorrowfully. But Nehemiah held fast. He explained the reason for his sadness, and seconds later, Artaxerxes had pivoted completely and amazingly was asking Nehemiah, how can I help you? That's an amazing turn of events. Who can cause that? God, right? Only God. It was God who providentially changed the heart of the king. But here's what I want you to see. In order to see that happen, Nehemiah had to do one big thing. He had to step out in faith, and he had to act courageously. Right? You see, if Nehemiah had melted when initially challenged, maybe threatened by Artaxerxes, if he'd melted initially, he never would have been able to go to Jerusalem. He never would have been able to see God work in such a mighty way. But Nehemiah didn't back down, did he? He spoke up. Why did he do that? Why did Nehemiah speak up when everything within him probably told him to not do that? Well, Nehemiah took his stand. Here's the answer. He took his stand and he spoke out because, listen to this, because his faith and trust in Yahweh were infinitely greater than his fear of Artaxerxes. Folks, here's one thing you need to take from today's message. As you think about the meaning of the book of Nehemiah, as you think about really its central message, this is what you need to take. One thing that you have to take is that faith in God's sovereignty, not fear, governed Nehemiah's life. Faith governed his life, not fear. He lived by faith. Such a big take for us as Christians, such a big application there. Nehemiah did not let the fear of the unknown stop his service of Yahweh, who he did know. I don't think that it's wrong to say that in these days that there are a lot of Christians who are living by fear and not by faith. Folks, that's sin. Don't do that. Live by faith. Nehemiah lived not by fear. He lived by faith in Yahweh. You need to see that it's that simple. Nehemiah lived by faith, and God rewarded his faith by turning the heart of the king so that he then finds himself saying, okay, Nehemiah, what can I do for you? How can I serve you, Nehemiah? Do you see the irony there? Nehemiah is the servant of the king. But Nehemiah's true king is Yahweh, who he really ultimately trusts. Yahweh simply tweaks Artaxerxes, so now he's the servant. Nehemiah, how can I help you? It was an amazing answer. I hope that you see it for that. It was an answer, in fact, that was so positive. It was so positive that it seems to have caught even Nehemiah just a little off guard. I think that's understandable. Nehemiah at this point would not have yet been certain of all that he might need, right? He probably was not certain of how generous Artaxerxes might be. And so in that uncertain position, guess what Nehemiah does? He prays again. He prays again. Keep reading. Look at the rest of verse 4. He says, so I prayed to the God of heaven. That may be the purest example of instant silent prayer in all of Scripture. I prayed to the God of heaven, and God heard and intervened. And here's what God did. He emboldened Nehemiah to answer Artaxerxes and to make that huge request. Look at it again, verse 5. I said to the king, now emboldened by Yahweh, Nehemiah says, I said to the king, verse 5, if it please the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. And we touched on this last week. I think that was a big ask. Right? That was a huge ask. Remember who Nehemiah is. He is the cupbearer to Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes, again, is the most powerful man on the face of the planet. He is the king of the Persian Empire. Nehemiah is his cupbearer. Do you know what that means by definition? It means that Nehemiah was his most closely trusted advisor. If you're going to assassinate Artaxerxes, you've got to get through Nehemiah. It's reasonable to think that they were friends. It's right to think that Nehemiah was an important counselor. Jerusalem was hundreds of miles away. What's Nehemiah asking Artaxerxes here? He's saying, Artaxerxes, can I leave your service for a long time to go and to serve the Jews who didn't mean a thing to Artaxerxes? Folks, it was a big ask. Amazingly, though, Artaxerxes sent Nehemiah with his full blessing. Again, this is God at work. Look at verse 6. Then the king said to me. And it's almost as though Nehemiah is just simply a puppet here. Then the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, how long will your journey be and when will you return? Now get this, so it pleased the king to send me, and I gave him a definite time, and I love the order there. Before Nehemiah even got the definite time out, Artaxerxes had already said, fine, let's send you. Again, to be clear, this was it was a completely improbable turn of events. It's interesting that Nehemiah tells us that the queen was seated there by the king. Again, perhaps it's a festival. You almost imagine here, I think, the queen looking on and saying to herself, what just happened there? Did Artaxerxes just say that Nehemiah could go to Jerusalem because he asked him? That's exactly what had happened. You see, we know what happened. God answered Nehemiah's prayers by working in the heart of Artaxerxes. And here's an important outcome of that. Nehemiah's looking on. He sees the way that God is at work here. God's work in the heart of Artaxerxes did this for Nehemiah. It strengthened his faith even further. It strengthened his faith even further, get this, so that Nehemiah just kept on asking for more and more. Has God ever done that for you? Has God ever just given you more than you even asked for, and so you just kept asking? That's what happens here. Nehemiah is so emboldened that he just keeps asking for more and more. Verse 7, and I said to the king, look at it. If it please the king, let letters be given to me for governors of the provinces beyond the river, that they may allow me to pass through there until I come to Judah. In other words, what Nehemiah has asked for there from Artaxerxes was guaranteed safe passage. If you'd gone on a journey like that, you would have needed it. And by the way, if you were bearing letters from Artaxerxes, no one would have touched you. Seems like a reasonable ask. If you're going to send me, Artaxerxes, grant me safe passage. But verse 8, I think, is where it gets good. And Artaxerxes, would you also give me a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress by the temple, for the wall of the city. Look at this. And for the house to which I will go. Now, did you take that in? The request there was for Artaxerxes to pay for all of it. Did you get the end of it there? Even for a place for Nehemiah. He was shamefully bold. And again, Artaxerxes said, sure, no problem. Right? 8b, sure, no problem. And writing in the first person, remember, as Nehemiah does through much of the book, he tells us why it went down this way. Look at verse 8 again. Look at this part way through. The king granted them to me. And the idea is that the king granted, that Artaxerxes granted everything that Nehemiah asked. The king granted to me everything I asked. Look at this. Here's the reason. Because the good hand of my God was on me. That's the reason for Nehemiah's success. And it's extremely important that you understand that it was the product of his faith in God. It was the product of his faith in God. Throughout his ministry, as we go deeper into the book of Nehemiah, throughout his ministry, we'll see him confronted by challenges. We will see him confronted by difficulties. We will see him confronted even by danger. But listen, through it all, the thing that will always shine through about Nehemiah, the thing that will always sustain Nehemiah, will be his faith. Nehemiah's trust in God was always greater than his temporal circumstances, no matter how difficult they may have been. Think back. Upon hearing the news of the dire straits of Jerusalem, Nehemiah fasted and prayed and repented. Then when Artaxerxes seemed to be an obstacle, Nehemiah prayed again. And again he courageously stood and spoke for God's people. And you need to see here this morning that that is the pattern that consistently marked his life and ministry. Whenever Nehemiah was in need, whenever Nehemiah was confronted by hardship, whenever Nehemiah was in danger, you could always count on him to do one thing. You could always count on him to pray. In fact, Nehemiah offers 9 such prayers in this book. Nehemiah was a man of prayer. You know why he was a man of prayer? Because he was a man of faith. We could turn that couplet and we could say that he was a man of faith because he was a man of prayer. Let's talk a little bit about the relationship between prayer and faith. This is one thing you need to understand about prayer. You need to understand that real prayer, authentic prayer, is birthed in the recognition of personal weakness and inability. Let me say that again. You need to get that. Authentic prayer is birthed in the recognition of personal weakness and inability. Isn't that right? We're driven to pray truly when we recognize our own inability to do anything. But if that's all prayer was about, it would only be a celebration of despair, but it's not that. Prayer begins with that acknowledgement of personal weakness, of personal inability. But it doesn't end there. Authentic prayer goes on and it proclaims God's omnipotent greatness. Proclaims God's ability always to accomplish His will. And we're making a simple point here. And it's that through Nehemiah's example of prayer, we see his dependence on and his trust in God. Let me make that a little bit simpler for you. Tough times and big challenges always drove Nehemiah to prayer. And in that we see that he was a man of faith. Let's become just a little bit contemplative here. When hard times come, when difficulties come, when you're tempted to be fearful, when you're tempted to relent, to give in, to do the wrong thing, what do? Do you pray? I hope that you do. Because understand that retreating to prayer, that is actually indicative of great faith. That's indicative of great strength and faith in God. I'm going to tell you this morning that Nehemiah's prayer life, coupled with his faith, and those two things are inseparable. Nehemiah's great faith, which fueled his prayer life, and his prayer life, which fueled his faith, Those things together in tandem, they were the foundational secret to Nehemiah's success. This is not difficult to figure out when you read the book. When God would give Nehemiah a job that was so big that he couldn't possibly do it on his own, Nehemiah would always do the same thing. He would take it back to God in prayer and he would trust God to accomplish it. Many of you are familiar with Hudson Taylor, great missionary. Hudson Taylor once said, all God's giants, listen to this, all God's giants have been weak men who did great things for God because they reckon on God being with them. And that was Nehemiah. He was used mightily by God, not because he was personally formidable, although maybe he was. That's not the reason he was used mightily by God, though. Nehemiah was used mightily by God, listen, because he trusted God to work through him. He trusted God to sustain him in difficult times. He trusted God to go before him and remove obstacles. Nehemiah was the leader he was. He was the one who could accomplish the way that he did because he was a man of faith. He trusted God. He trusted God specifically to work through him. Now, to be sure, he was a man of action. And certainly you see that in this book. Nehemiah was a man of action, but understand this, he didn't rest in his own ability. Nehemiah rested in God's power. Nehemiah rested in God's plan. He rested in God's sovereignty. And beloved, I want to say to you this morning that if you and I are going to be useful in God's service, first and foremost, we must trust Him in every circumstance like Nehemiah did. We must refuse to be backed down by hard times, by hardship, by fear. And instead of backing down, we need to go to the Lord in prayer. Nehemiah was a man of faith. If we're going to be useful in God's service, we need to be committed to be people of faith. We need to be committed to trust God in every circumstance. Now let me give you the other commitment we're going to look at today. This is the second of 5. Unless we add more between now and next week. This is the second of 5. Second commitment, to be able to persevere. And by the way, you have to be able to persevere. Let's just touch on that again. You must be able to persevere in order to be able to serve. So, to be able to persevere and to be able to be truly useful in God's service, in other words, to be able to experience the joy of being used by God, then like Nehemiah, we must be committed to loving the people of God sacrificially. We have to be committed to loving one another sacrificially. Did Nehemiah do that? Did he love his people sacrificially? Of course he did. Back up to chapter 1. Chapter 1. Look at verse 2. Nehemiah's there serving at court in Susa. Life is well for him, remember? He's prominent, he's prosperous. Then look, it came about that Hanani, one of my brothers, and some men from Judah came, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped and had survived the captivity and about Jerusalem. They said to me, the remnant there, the Jews, the people, the remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and reproach. And the wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are burned with fire. And you remember verse 4, look at it. When I heard these words, when he heard of the estate of his people, when I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. There are two things that are devastating to Nehemiah in those verses, right? You can see these. Two things that are devastating to Nehemiah. One thing that's devastating to Nehemiah as he hears that report is that Jerusalem remained in a state of disrepair. You see, faithful Jews like Nehemiah equated Jerusalem with the temple of God, and in a sense they equated it with the covenant that God had given David, right? And they even equated it with God's glory. And so the idea of Jerusalem suffering was upsetting. But the other thing here that was devastating to Nehemiah, the other thing, and I would say here, maybe the big thing here that was devastating to him was the report in verse 3 that the people were suffering, literally that they were in great trouble and shame. And we would know by now the pattern for what Nehemiah would do when confronted with news like this. His love for the people compelled him to immediately intercede for them in prayer. Remember? Keep reading. Look at verse 5. I said, I beseech you, O Yahweh, God of heaven, the great and awesome God who preserves and the covenant and loving kindness for those who love him and keep his commandments. Let your ear now be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, which I am praying before you now, day and night, on behalf of the sons of Israel, your servants. As we've seen today, his love for the people didn't stop with just praying for them. It compelled him even to go to Artaxerxes and to seek leave, and ultimately even to resign his position in Persia's royal court so that he could go to Jerusalem to minister. And folks, you need to see that that was sacrificial love. That was sacrificial love. Remember Nehemiah's station in life. He's living high. He's up here. He's the closest advisor and the servant to the most powerful man on earth. What do we know about Judah and Jerusalem at this time? Well, it had been ground to powder. It was dust. It was a meaningless province of the Persian Empire beyond the river. The people were in despair. They were in danger. Do you see the exchange here? That's what sacrificial love is. Do you understand that? Sacrificial love is love that exchanges one great estate for one humble estate. That's what Nehemiah did. Now, I'm not equating Nehemiah as being a type of Christ, but is that not what Jesus did? He exchanged this high estate for this low estate. I'm just telling you that Nehemiah loved his people with sacrificial, dare I say it, with Christ-like love. Let's be clear this morning. That's always ministry's true motivation. Always. Do you know what you call loveless ministry? Legalism. Real ministry is always motivated by sacrificial love. If Nehemiah had not loved God's people, there is no way that he would have agonized over their pain, prayed for them, even identified with their sin and repented in solidarity with them, and ultimately left the lap of luxury to serve them. I think you can see this. That remains true for us today. The application here is not difficult. Let me try to give it to you in a single statement. To be able to serve well, you must first love well. Right? To be able to serve well, you must first love well. Do you remember what Jesus said to the disciples in John 13 about love and being a disciple of His? I want you to see this. Turn to John 13. John 13. How necessary is love for us as believers? How foundational is it for us in our service? Chapter 13. Look at verse 34. Jesus said to the disciples, He says to us through His word, a new commandment I give to you. Did you get that? A new commandment, not suggestion. New commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Even as I have loved you. Right? That you love one another how? Sacrificially. You love one another even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. Verse 35, by this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Love motivates and enables us to serve well. Love also authenticates our place as disciples of Jesus. By this all men will know that you're my disciples if you have love for one another. And I want you to see also there that the point of that isn't merely that we tell other believers that we love them. That's an important thing to do, by the way. Believers should be able to say, hey, I love you. But that's not all that's at stake here. The point in the Lord's instruction here is not merely that we tell other believers that we love them. The point here, I think, ultimately is that we show that we love them through our service and through our actions. Turn forward to John chapter 21. John chapter 21. You know the context here? Jesus has been raised from the dead. He comes and he visits the disciples, remember, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. You remember, he's got a message for Peter. So he goes for a walk with Peter. Look at verse 15. Remember, Jesus served them breakfast, created the fish and served them breakfast. Amazing story. That was service, by the way. So when they'd finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Peter said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Now look at this. Jesus said to Peter, tend my lambs. And again on this occasion, do you know what Jesus will tell Peter to do? He'll say, serve my sheep. What's the point? Folks, the point is that love is the basis and the true motivation for ministry. I'm going to say it one more time. You will never serve well until you love sacrificially. You'll never serve well until you love sacrificially. So the question, I suppose, is how's your service? And maybe even beyond that, we could say that the greater question is, how's your love? How's your love? We want to serve God well as a people at Heritage Church, don't we? We want to serve God well. We can take from Nehemiah, we can glean from his book commitments that we need to make to be able to serve well. We've done that this morning. We've started with 2. Serving well begins with the commitment to trust God unconditionally, because that's where our strength and perseverance come from. And it's God's strength that the victory comes from, right? And beyond that, secondly, we've seen this morning that to be able to serve well, we must first commit ourselves to loving well, to loving sacrificially. We'll finish next week with 3 more commitments for serving well. But today I want us to close with 2 big applications that I think are all over this text. And I'm going to give you these applications in the form of instructions. These are not going to be contemplative applications so much as they're going to be demands, I believe, from the Word of God. And reflection on Nehemiah's story, folks. Make sure that you choose faith over fear. Choose faith over fear. Let me put that differently. Choose service over safety. Again, what a crazy time we live in. Folks, God does not intend for His church to shelter in place. Choose faith over fear. Choose service over safety. Why do you want to do that? Let me give you one simple reason. Because faith pleases God, fear displeases God. You say, how do you know that? Because His Word is filled with exhortations to not fear. Choose faith over fear. Choose service over safety. We're studying Habakkuk on Wednesday nights. Habakkuk 2:4, you all know it. The righteous shall live by fear. Oh, no, wait a minute. The righteous shall live by faith. They'll live by faith. Choose faith over fear, service over safety. Application 2, again, we're going to cast it as an instruction. Instruction number 2, pray big. Pray big. Now here's a caveat. Make sure that to start with, you're walking in God's will according to His Word. But once you're sure of that, pray big. Ask God for big things. If we learn nothing else from Nehemiah, we should learn that, right? Believe in God, walk in His Word, and ask Him for big things. And do you know what? He'll give them to you. He'll bring about big things. Folks, the sovereignty of God is all over these books we've been studying. It's shot all the way through the book of Ezra, the book of Esther. Now we're seeing it in the book of Nehemiah. We serve the sovereign God of the universe. He called it into being with the breath of His mouth. What do we have to be afraid of? Not a thing. It's good to be a child of the King, isn't it? Let's pray together. Father, we're grateful for Your love and for Your grace. Father, as we consider the ultimate greatness of who You are, Father, when we consider that there are none like You, Lord, there is not even one like You. Lord, what an amazing and humbling realization that is. Father, what an amazing thing to be called into relationship with You. Father, I pray that we would always be a people, Lord, who remember who You are. And Father, who serve You accordingly. God, help us to walk in faith. Father, help us to pray big things. God, help us to love well. Lord, we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.